Shashi has had a really interesting life, so we're going to explore that a little bit, talk about his new book as well, which is called The Struggle for India's Soul, Nationalism and the Fate of Democracy, which sounds a slightly intimidating title, but it's a really, really interesting read. Talks a lot about Prime Minister Modi. And I always think we don't really know enough about India in this country. I mean, given our mutual history, I wonder why India in general, not just Indian politics, doesn't get the coverage on the UK media that it merits. When you think about it, what's the population of India? 1.2 billion?
No, 1.3 plus. In fact, close to 1.4.
1.3 billion. And within the next 10 or 20 years, I mean, India is going to be one of the two major players in the world, India and China. I mean, we all know that. So why don't we talk about India more than we do? Well, that's what we're going to do over the next hour. Shashi, welcome to LBC.
Thank you, Iain. Good to be with you.
Now, you were born in London, though, weren't you?
Yes, indeed. My parents happened to be living here at the time, but my father never saw himself as a permanent migrant. He came here as a student in 1948, stayed on, and eventually, a decade later, he was a locally recruited London manager for an Indian newspaper, The Statesman, all of whose managers in India were Englishmen. So he actually waited for an Englishman to retire in order to bid for a managerial position in India, and he won it to head the Bombay office. And off we went, and I was all of 2 years old.
Do you ever wonder how different your life would have been had you stayed in London?
Yes, I suppose it would have been extremely different, but I mean, it's now one of those things that there's no point thinking about. I grew up in India, became rather, I think, conscious of myself as an Indian. I've talked about this a bit in the new book, and I've and then I've had this sort of international career, 29 years at the United Nations, and then come back to an India which in which I'd really not even lived half my life, in order to sort of rediscover my India and I hope to rediscover a bit of myself as an Indian. And that's what I've been up to for the last a little over 13 years now.
And what have you discovered? I mean, going back after such a long time, I mean, everything would have changed, I imagine.
Well, no, that was the astonishing thing. I mean, in essence, the India I'd grown up in the 60s and early 70s had not changed when I went back in 2008. In fact, of course, I was going back every year on holidays, vacations, visiting parents and family and so on. So it's not as if I was out of touch. And I had stayed engaged intellectually with India. My books were largely centered on India. So it's not that I was uninvolved or that there was this dramatic transformation. There were a couple of things that had changed. The economy had liberalized. You suddenly had a country that was awash in internationally known consumer products, which we'd never had when I was growing up in a much more protectionist India. So there were those kinds of superficial changes. But the essential change, this was a country of astonishing diversity, people getting along despite the most appalling sufferings of poverty and misery, and at the same time, the most astonishing differences, religion, caste, creed, color, region, language, and yet dreaming the same dreams together. And that, I thought, was the magic of India that hadn't changed. So when I got into Indian politics for the first time, the elections of 2009, and won my seat, I came in with a lot of enthusiasm and idealism, which turned out in the end not to have been vindicated. We had the government had a not terribly good term. There were widespread perceptions, accurate or not is debatable, but this is not the time or place to debate it, that it was either corrupt or ineffective or both. And of course, we saw the rise of Narendra Modi, who, having had a record as a hardline Hindutva nationalist in the BJP, as chief minister of the western state of Gujarat, then proceeded to conduct a campaign essentially as an economic reformer. He essentially sold himself to the Indian public as the CEO of Gujarat Inc. and said, I'll do for India what I've done for my state, vote for me and everyone will have a job, the country will prosper, and so on. And I think it was that message, rather than the Hindu chauvinist or the Hindu nationalist message, that brought him into power in 2014. I was elected in a much more of a squeaker this time to my seat, but most of my party wasn't. We tumbled from 216 seats in the lower house to 44. And As one of the 44, of course, I took upon myself a lot of the task of articulating critiques of what the government was trying to do. 5 years later, I think the government, having grown in effectiveness and popularity in terms of election results, won an even bigger majority. I should stress, though, that because of our first-past-the-post system inherited from you lot, he won the first election with 31% of the vote, which gave him about 55% of the seats. And the second election with 37% of the vote gave him over 60% of the seats. So it's one of these situations where the government has a significant majority in the House, but not yet a significant majority of the electorate. But we do have a very fractious political system, and so the opposition parties are numerous and divided and rarely make common cause. And so we have something like 46 parties represented in Parliament.
46?
Yeah, in a Parliament of 543, wow. And there'll be some with one member, some with two.
That's really interesting, because you would think first past the post would actually not result in loads of different parties, wouldn't you? Or is it because of India's size that
because
it does?
Of India's size and diversity.
Yeah.
I mean, the Congress Party in its heyday was the only party that truly had a presence in every corner of the country, in every district of the country. The BJP to this day is essentially non-existent in a couple of the southern states. I shouldn't say non-existent, that's cruel. They exist, they have chapters, but they're not contenders in a couple of the southern states at all.
And how big is the Indian Parliament?
543 in the lower house, 240 odd in the upper house.
You've got 543 members of Parliament representing 1.3 billion people, and we have 650 representing 55.
That's right, which gives your MPs far more connect with smaller constituencies. I represent 2 million people in Parliament.
Wow!
So for me, the very notion of being able to go door to door and see them all, or have any. I mean, I remember when a British parliamentary delegation was visiting under Speaker Burkow, and so we had. I was one of the handful of MPs who met with them and chatted, and one of the MPs said, "So do you have surgeries?" I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "On a busy day, I can see up to 6 or 7 people." I said, on a light day, I see 250. And that is essentially a big difference. It also means that the kind of personal connect that the average British MP has or should have or can have is simply not a realistic prospect. But having said that, the numbers may go up. The BJP is thinking quite seriously of amending or allowing the Constitution to be changed to allow more MPs, particularly from the northern states where the BJP is very strong and whose population has increased.
Funny that.
But their population has increased, right. Whereas the states where the BJP is not terribly strong are the states that are more educated, have more empowered women, fewer children.
So which part of India do you represent?
So I represent the capital of the state of Kerala in the southwest. So you can imagine me on Parliament session time, Monday to Friday in Delhi, Friday evening, hop onto a plane, fly as far as it is possible to fly southwards without falling into the water, land in Thiruvananthapuram, which is the southernmost airport in the mainland of India, spend Saturday and Sunday in the constituency, and then fly back either late Sunday night or the wee hours of Monday morning to resume Parliament. It's quite an arduous job.
I'm going to shamefully admit that I'd never heard of Kerala until last week.
What happened
when I was listening to a podcast with Andrew Neil, who's a very famous interviewer in this country, interviewing a left-wing commentator called Ash Sarkar, and he asked her, where in the world has communism ever worked? And she quoted Kerala, and he said, no, that's not a country, that's a region.
Well, it has worked, but in all fairness, what the communists point to as accomplishments are also pointed to by the other parties. In other words, it was almost a cultural accomplishment of the people of Kerala, though I will give the communists credit for having contributed in their own way to this. The extraordinary human development indicators in Kerala, which are extraordinary because they're comparable in every respect to the most developed countries in the world, to America, for example. Look at the number of nurses, number of doctors, number of hospital beds per patient, number of newspapers per head of population. You go through all of these indicators, and they're all comparable, in some cases better than the United States, on about 1/70th the per capita income. And it's partially because this was a state that emphasized all the right things early on. Indeed, well before communism was born, the Queen of Travancore, which accounts for much of southern Kerala, actually became the first, made her country the first country in the entire world, including America, Britain, Europe, whatever, the first country in the entire world to decree universal, free, and compulsory education for both boys and girls. Where it was available, girls were usually excluded in the Western world, and where the elite could afford it, the poor didn't, and so on. Whereas in Kerala, in Travancore, boys and girls, without regard to means, and as I say, without regard to gender, were able to go and get educated.
Now, I suspect you and I could chat between ourselves for the next hour with absolutely no problem at all, and we may do, but I would like people listening to call in if you've got a question for Shashi Tharoor, 0345 6060 973. You may want to ask a bit more about Prime Minister Modi, because although he is the Prime Minister of a country of 1.3 billion people, I don't think we really know too much about him. We don't really maybe understand him in the way that we ought to. Why do you think that is? Is it due to the fact that the British media, European media, actually maybe world media, is just so concentrated on a few areas dominated by the United States, dominated by issues in Europe? Why do you think it is that we don't really know enough about India? We've got the internet now, so we can look up everything up if we want, but I just wonder why India doesn't feature on our news programmes as much as it ought to. Well, we're putting that right tonight. We're talking about Shashi's new book, The Struggle for India's Soul, Nationalism and the Fate of Democracy. Might talk about one of his previous books on the empire as well. 0345 6060 973. It's 9:15.
This is LBC.
Hello.
Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
19 minutes past 9 on LBC. Jane has texted in to say, Kerala has the most amazing food and I can't believe you've never heard of the region. Well, you see, I could come into this hour pretending that I was a world expert on India and probably carry it off if I really tried, but I don't see the point in pretending that I know something that I don't. So there we go. We are in the company of Shashi Tharoor. His new book is called The Struggle for India's Soul, Nationalism and the Fate of Democracy. We're going to come to your calls in a few minutes' time, 0345 6060 973. And by the way, you can watch us on Global Player if you're not already doing so. It's such a vast country. How does political campaigning work in India? Because I've seen lots of sort of television pictures. It looks quite chaotic.
It is. It's quite amazing, actually, because, again, we have elections to the state assemblies as well as to the national parliament. So whereas I have to campaign amongst 2 million people to win my seat, my parliamentary constituency embraces 7 state assembly constituencies. And when they go to the polls, it's even more intense, but because it's smaller. So people have the time to go more locally, as it were. But having said that, so we still do a lot of what you would think of as old-fashioned campaigning, I think. There are posters stuck on walls, whitewashing of people, usually nowadays with permission, whitewashing of people's walls and writing party slogans on them and so on. So you've got all of that stuff. You've got people inventing election songs for candidates. And then these are blared out both along with the vehicle convoy of the candidate himself or herself, as well as just simply going around in the constituency to attract people's attention. You've got something called, in Kerala, called the Pariyannam, which is after you've done the initial bits of campaigning, laying out your manifesto and so on, the last week or so, you simply stand on top of an open jeep for 18 hours a day. And you go from place to place in the constituency, stopping about every 10 or 15 minutes and speaking. So you'll deliver 100 speeches a day.
And the same
too
speech.
Short to make, usually, yes, or variations thereof. If you find a large crowd, you might embellish it. If you find a small knot of people at a junction, you might shorten it. But, so you've all of these things. I think none of this happens in Western democracies, but they all happen in India. We also, of course, have mailers and people slipping posters under people's doors. But because of the size of the national constituencies, much less door-to-door campaigning. And of course, now mass media and social media are also significant. But that too goes through changes. Kerala was one of the places in India where debates on every channel amongst the candidates were very common. And in Kerala, frankly, we have 13 all-news channels broadcasting news for all the time.
To 2 million
and
people.
Every one of them wanted us, to 2 million people. And every one of them wanted a debate amongst all the candidates. And after a while, it became wearing, number one. Number two, because, again, in the Kerala practice, the debates took place in a public spot, literally an open square or a park or something, and anybody could come. Your rival parties make sure they stacked the audience with their people to heckle you, to ask you rude questions and so on. And after a while, I think many of the candidates kept saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore, we don't want to participate. And that kind of broke the magic of it. My first couple of elections, I must have done multiple debates. By the time my third election in 2019, there was only one, I think, debate, or at most two. Most of the others had given up on, people weren't willing to participate.
It sounds quite an experience. I think when you have another election, I want to come and be your candidate aide or something.
About 19th century politics must have been like this in America and Britain, I imagine, much more. But anyway.
Although actually, American presidential candidates in the 19th century, they didn't actually do any campaigning. They just stayed at home and people would come to visit them. Bizarre.
Or rode to the back of trains.
Yeah, exactly. And in the Indian Parliament, what percentage of the MPs are female?
Not enough. 11%, I think, is the last figure I checked. It might have gone up to 14. Can't remember whether 11% was the previous parliament or the present one, but it's still way short of where it should be. 11 to 14%. In fact, my party tried to get a bill through when we were in power. We got it through the upper house, didn't make it to the lower. That would have reserved seats, 1/3 of the seats for women representatives. That is controversial among some. But I think in theory, all the principal parties had endorsed this. Yet when the BJP, which had endorsed it, came to power, they never introduced or reintroduced this women's reservation bill in Parliament.
We'll come to the calls in just a second, but before we do, just want to have a quick word about British-Indian relations. How do you see the relationship between India and Britain at the moment?
At the moment, I would say it's not bad. It's had its downs as well as its ups. And I think part of the difficulty has been that there was a sense that India wasn't getting a fair shake here. And I still remember the outrage with which the news was greeted that an Indian student graduating from a British university was given the right to work in some sort of internship kind of or practical learning capacity for 2 months, whereas a Chinese student at the same institution with the same degree would get 2 years. And this was something we couldn't understand, especially when there were so many in Britain talking about the special relationship with their former colony and so on. And this was how they were treating us. And so there was a lot of resentment of that. Of course, that has subsequently been revised, but there have been issues relating to things like immigration, work permits, tourist visas, and all of those things.
I think they have recently changed the system, haven't they? So an Indian graduate can work here for 2 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So now the Indian may be on the same page as the Chinese. I don't know if they also improved the terms of the Chinese and they've gone up to 3.
Not sure our relations with the Chinese are terribly good at the moment.
I imagine you're right.
Now, Mr. Modi has achieved some negative headlines here for his attitude to Russia and Ukraine. I mean, how has his stance on that gone down in India, where he hasn't sort of necessarily supported Putin, but it's verging on
He hasn't condemned it.
No.
I mean, I think the thing is that his position is still broadly popular in India. I'm really almost alone in my criticism of it, but I was an early objector. First to the tone of the Indian initial statements of the UN, which have since been modified, because our very first couple of statements didn't even stand up for the principles that India's been advocating for the last 75 years in world affairs. You know, the sovereignty of states, the UN Charter, international law, the inviolability of borders, and the inadmissibility of the use of force, all of which I thought, at the very least, we could have said, instead of a rather mealy-mouthed initial statement saying, we would want diplomacy to be pursued by both sides and we urge restraint on both sides. You can't urge a side that's defending itself against an unprovoked aggression to exercise restraint. But anyway, to cut a long story short, India has toughened its language since then, and they have been much more critical of what's going on without naming Russia. The reason they don't name Russia or condemn it directly is, I think, principally a couple of things. First, a very long, close relationship when the West was hostile to India on matters like Kashmir and other matters of vital national interest. Russia was supportive and protected India through its veto in the Security Council during the bad years of the Cold War. Secondly, when the West was unwilling to sell India significant weaponry, despite the fact that we got a pasting in a war with China in 1962 and then had to face wars with Pakistan in 1965 and 1971 and so on, the West wasn't willing to give us any serious military equipment. The Russians were. So at one point, Russia was supplying as many as 85%, as much as 85% of India's defense equipment. And even though that's considerably come down now, I'd say to about 45, we still need the spare parts for 85. So all of that was, I think all these factors would have weighed heavily in India's mind. My answer to that would be that, first of all, it was the Soviet Union we needed to be grateful to and not just the Russians. And the Soviet Union included Ukraine as well. So I think that's something we have to bear in mind. But secondly, when it comes to something like weaponry, I'm afraid the Russians are not going to be able to supply us as whatever they've been able to in the past.
Having difficulty supplying themselves.
Exactly. They're finding it difficult to supply
let's go to a call. Lots of calls coming in. If you'd like to talk to Shashi or ask him a question, 0345 6060 973. Zach's in Maidenhead. Hello, Zach.
Yes, hello. Good evening.
Hello.
My question is, currently this religious nationalism, it seems to be very popular and it's growing. How do you think this will play out on the minorities in India?
Well, it's already quite worrying, because it began, as I say, with Mr. Modi's party, the BJP. But now that they've actually got unquestioned and unchallenged political power, they have rather given a free hand to a lot of people to advance what's called the Hindutva agenda. Hindutva is not quite Hinduism, which is an all-embracing religion that celebrates the acceptance of difference and celebrates diversity. Hindutva prefers to interpret Hinduism as a badge of identity. It's rather like taking this majestic faith and reducing it to something like the team loyalty of the British football hooligan, Support my team and I'm with you, otherwise I'm going to bash you on the head with the placard I'm carrying. That's sort of what Hindutva is trying to do. And the result of that has been a fair amount of alarm and concern amongst India's minorities, and in particular the Muslim minority, which has been especially demonized for some years now by the BJP, but particularly in the last 2 or 3 years since the re-election of the BJP government. Many of us have been speaking out strongly and writing strongly against this, and my book, The Struggle for India's Soul, is indeed about struggling for what kind of India do you want to cherish. You want to cherish an India where everyone is equally at home and has an equal stake, an India that is essentially built on diversity and pluralism? Or do you want an India that calls itself a Hindu Rashtra, as the Hindutva movement wants to, a nation of people of one particular identity, where everyone else is on sufferance as either a guest or a second-class citizen? To my mind, that would be a betrayal of the ideals of the freedom movement that Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and his cohort fought for. And that's why many of us resist this notion. So, Zach, your question is absolutely appropriate, because we have this problem in the country. And if you were to ask me what's significant, going back to Ian's first question about what's changed, the one thing that has changed since my return in 2008 is that with this new spirit of Hindutva abroad, there is a level of bigotry and intercommunal hatred and tension that I never expected to see in India, in the India that I grew up in.
We have another half an hour with Shashi. Zach, thank you very much indeed for your question. 0345 6060 973. It's 9:30 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines with David Dom.
Russia has sentenced 2 British men to death after being captured while fighting for Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has called the judgments handed to Aidan Aslin and Sean Pinner a sham. The average cost of filling a car up with petrol has topped £100 for the first time in what's being described as a dark day for drivers. Campaigners are calling for a further cut in fuel duty. The man in charge of policing the Champions League final has admitted the security operation in Paris was a failure. French authorities previously said thousands of Liverpool supporters had fake tickets, but now say that may have been a mistake. LBC weather: light rain pushing into the east this evening, largely dry overnight with some showers in the far southeast and northwest, with a low of 9.
This is LBC.
If you're
LBC.
It's 9:34 on LBC. Shashi Tharoor is with me taking your calls. Let's go to Shahid in Hemel Hempstead. Hello, Shahid.
Yeah, hello, Ian, and hello to Mr. Tharoor. I wanted to ask about the issue of Kashmir. And for the benefit of your listeners, it might just be helpful if I just quickly point out that when India and Pakistan, first got independence from Britain, the way it sort of was agreed amongst the political representatives at the time was that any state that had a Muslim majority would become part of Pakistan, or that's how it went about. Or if they had an autonomous ruler, they were given a choice. Kashmir, unfortunately, is one of those states that this situation was not resolved. It was a Muslim majority state. The autonomous ruler that I think was appointed by the British was a Hindu, and because Muslims wanted him to sign to Pakistan, and he wanted to be independent, I believe, and he eventually got very scared and he signed over to India. Both countries control parts of Kashmir. They've both been at loggerheads ever since independence. The main question I want to ask to Mr. Tharoor was, I generally think as somebody of Pakistani heritage, and my family's from Kashmir, I generally do get the impression that no Indian government really wants to settle this issue. They'd rather leave it in the unresolved, at loggerheads way. And does Mr. Tharoor agree with me? And does he think, why does Mr. Tharoor think this issue has remained unresolved for so long? How can it be resolved? Well, what is the best way to resolve this issue? Rather than leaving it at loggerheads, which is not good for either country.
Right. Well, I mean, the problem is it's a little more complicated than your summary, but I think you've done an admirable job of keeping it brief. There were a couple of complications, including the fact that in 1947-48, there was a very strong popular movement against the Maharaja, led by Sheikh Abdullah, who was a Muslim and a political leader with a very strong following. But he was anti the idea of Pakistan. He wanted a united India, and it was he, and not just the Maharaja's accession, that kept Kashmir within the Indian Union. It was he and his followers who preferred to be part of India than to go into a sort of one religious one religion-dominated state in Pakistan. That's a long and complicated history we can talk about. But since then, I would say that there have been various phases that have happened, and certainly one of the things that was more to India's favor was the fact that there were free and fair elections that brought various political parties to present themselves before the electorate. And indeed, all the victors were naturally from the majority Muslim community. And democracy seemed in many ways the best solution to the problem. Subsequently, at the end of the Afghan war in 1989, a lot of militants came in, including foreigners, Afghans, Sudanese, Arabs, and so on. Trains supplied, equipped by our friends across the border in Pakistan, and they wreaked havoc. And then that gave a massively security response from the Indian side, and the militarization of Kashmir has undermined what I think all Indians would prefer to see, which is a normally fully functioning democratic Kashmir as part of a democratic India. What's the solution? Ultimately, I think people will have to be given the freedom to determine their own political destiny through free and fair elections. I would agree with you that India, as long as it remains a secular state, would be completely unwilling to countenance any possibility of letting our portion of Kashmir go, for the simple reason that it was actually a great affirmation of the fact that your religious background didn't matter. Whereas in Pakistan, it was a country created for people of a particular religion. India had always insisted it was a country for people of every religion. And so in that sense, 2.4 million Kashmiri Muslims were part of a much larger 180 million population of Indian Muslims who felt as much stake in India as the 190 million Pakistani Muslims feel in Pakistan. So anyway, to cut a long story short, there is no simple solution. At the moment, Pakistan controls about 1/3 of the territory, slightly a larger percentage than that of the population. India has now slightly less than 2/3 of the state, but geographically speaking. But one large portion of that is the Union Territory of Ladakh, which is essentially not a Muslim majority area. Jammu and Kashmir, the Union Territory that remains, has the Kashmir Valley, which is overwhelmingly Muslim, and Jammu, which is much more evenly divided between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. So you've got a slightly more complicated demographic picture than a simplistic summary would suggest. And I think at the end of the day, the best recipe any of us can offer is more democracy for everyone to be able to choose their own leaders. And then ideally, if we had better peaceful relations between our two countries, people wouldn't encourage and finance and foment militancy across the border.
Has there ever been a time when relations between India and Pakistan have been vaguely normal?
There have been spasms of it, and I'd say the most recent was roughly between about 2003, I would say, or maybe, about 2 or 3, till about 2008, when the military dictator in Pakistan, General Musharraf, first of all had the Riot Act read to him by the Americans after 9/11, and the fact that the Afghans had been sheltering Osama bin Laden with Pakistani backing didn't go very well. And so he very quickly decided that his bread was buttered on the side of peace and of working with the West at that point against Islamic terrorism and so on. And so the terrorism dried up. They were no longer sending militants across the border. And there were even sort of extensive so-called back-channel conversations between India and Pakistan about a permanent settlement for Kashmir. But around 2008, before these things had fully fructified, he ran into domestic opposition in Pakistan that he couldn't overcome, and he lost power. And no subsequent government has either been strong enough or willing enough to go back on the path of peace. And now things are pretty grim between the two countries right now.
Shahid, thank you. We don't just lead Britain's conversation, we lead America's conversation, because Candia is phoned in from New York. Hello, Candia.
Hi, Ian, and hello to your guest. I think, I apologise in advance, I think my question might be a little bit niche, but I'm wondering what you think about the fact that Mr. Modi pulled New Delhi from getting World Heritage Site status and subsequently launched a massive development, a lot of us would say destruction, of the Lieutenant government area of New Delhi, including the big development all along the Raj Path.
That's right. Well, thank you for that, Kendi. I've actually written about this, and I'd urge you to Google my piece to get my views in more detail. But I do agree that this was an unnecessary example of sort of the grandiosity that certain kinds of rulers are particularly prone to. I won't say that everything was perfect about the previous arrangement, but certainly it was much more human in dimensions and accessibility, and areas which, for example, middle-class families would come and picnic over weekends are now essentially going to be lost because they've all been commandeered for this series of tall government buildings on both sides of a grand avenue and so on, which is the kind of vision that they're now implementing. So I do understand your concern. Many of my architect friends in India share that concern, but it's a battle that's already been lost. This proposal by the government was steamrolled through without adequate environmental or other consultations, public consultations, and now it's well advanced. The new parliament building that is being built to replace the one that Lutyens and Sir Herbert Baker had built in the 1920s, that's coming up and is supposed to be ready by the end of this year for our winter session of Parliament already. And some of the other government buildings will take longer, but that entire scheme is very much, is now, I think, impossible to reverse.
And this is very niche, but in terms of the parliamentary chamber, I mean, what's the current one? Is it sort of like the House of Commons, very adversarial, or is it a hemicycle like the Bundestag?
Well, it is actually a hemicycle, but it's still adversarial in the sense that the Treasury benches are on one side and we are on the other. Of course, nowadays the Treasury benches have so many MPs that even in the curve of the hemisphere, they're there too. What is problematic is, though, rather like the House of Commons, there's far too little room for each individual MP. There's very little room between the MP and the bench and the desk, and practically no room for somebody to get up and go to the loo or whatever. It really is a problem. So that is a change that many MPs would have wanted. But we would have not wanted to lose this wonderful, grand old historic building that we've been in.
Candia, thank you very much for your question. Chris in Staines has texted in, please ask your guest if India is ever likely to sign a trade agreement with the UK. Where are we on that?
Well, we're certainly making better progress than anyone thought possible even a couple of years ago. The part of the problem was what I've already alluded to. That is that we could understand Britain wanting to sell us whiskey and automobile parts and so on, all of which we buy and consume, and sure, they'd like to have lower tariffs so they can sell more of them. But the question was, what was Britain willing to give India in return? And for us, you sell us whiskey, we'd like to sell you people. Not that we want them to migrate to you, we want them to come back and work for us, but we'd like them to study here, to acquire expertise here, to acquire experience in your companies and so on. And you weren't allowing them to do that. So unless you give us some concessions, what are we going to sign for? We know what's in it for you, what's in it for us. So that was essentially where the hold-up was. I understand that of late, in the last year or so, the government of Boris Johnson has made a number of concessions that weren't on the table earlier, and they may well be encouraging progress. In fact, I'm privately hearing from sources in government that progress is moving along rather nicely.
Well, that's good news, isn't it? We'll take some more of your calls in just a moment with Shashi Tharoor. His book, I will remind you again, is called The Struggle for India's Soul. It's 9:45.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick.
The family of a man imprisoned in Iraq for 15 years for taking rocks says he will die in prison without help. How much responsibility should the government bear for getting him out?
Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
9:49 here on LBC. We have Shashi Tharoor with us taking your calls. Seth is in St John's Wood. Hello, Seth.
Hello, Iain, Mr. Tharoor.
Hello.
What would you like to ask?
My question is that if you look at the history of India for more than 2,000 years, India has gone through tremendous phases of integration and disintegration, starting from the time of Ashoka, then on to the Guptas and the Mughals and the British. The final great integration of India was under British rule when India was a united country. Now, within my lifetime, actually, in the British left, one India became two, which is India and Pakistan. Then, as recently as 1971, Bangladesh was created because Pakistan was split up. So one India became three countries now, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Now, the question is that with a leader as divisive as Mr. Modi, the very secular foundations of India, which are the basis for its unity, apart from the linguistic divisions and a lot of other factors, cultural, language, everything. With a leader as divisive as Mr. Modi, are we now in the stage of disintegration of India if one stands back from the mosaic and looks at the total flow of history?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think even those of us in the opposition who are fierce critics of what's been going on under the watch of Mr. Modi's government would never want to suggest that's an option. But certainly integration across communities, across religious divides is certainly affected by the growing consciousness of people's religious backgrounds and so on. Now, another controversy has been whipped up about language, with some of the BJP elements pushing very strongly for Hindi to become a national language, a national link language, and so on, which unfortunately will represent the interests of the Hindi heartland, the cow belt as we sometimes call it, where the BJP is strong, but would not be welcome at all in large parts of the south, the east, the northeast, and elsewhere. And so these are problems. I mean, that the spirit of national integration, which was sort of a hallowed cliche in my childhood in India, every politician would spout the need for national integration, by which was meant cooperation, harmony, coexistence across all these divides of religion, of region, of language, and so on. That should not be replaced by a spirit of national disintegration. I still don't think that there's a serious risk of any sort yet of territorial disintegration, as your question seemed to imply, but a disintegration of the spirit of unity, of people feeling different from each other because of their religion or because of their language or because of where they were born in India. That would be equally alarming to me.
Is India too big to govern?
I don't think it needs to be seen that way. I mean, it is an enormously big country in terms of population. I think it's all poised to overtake China in 2026 as the most populous country in the world, and that is no small matter. But at the same time, democracy had actually proved an extremely effective way of managing this vast diversity through effective decentralization. Give power not just to the state governments, but even lower down to the village councils, the district councils, and so on. And I think if we went more in that direction, you could actually govern India effectively by empowering the grassroots rather than empowering just the people at the top.
Phil says, great show, Iain, as usual. How you never got the question time gig, I'll never know. I didn't apply for it. That would be one reason. Plenty of others. Kerala is a lovely state from where many, many nurses practicing in the UK have come from. You must visit and go on the backwaters, then have a visit to Goa. Outstanding people and country. Well, I'm getting the taste for it. I think I would like to go.
You must come to Kerala. It's a gorgeous place. Lots of rivers and jungles and hills and beaches and all of that as well. So
there's no reason why I've never been to India.
It's also got the highest literacy rate in India, if that's any use to you. And we do have the highest number of nurses per capita, as your questioner says.
Well, we're very glad to take
and we
some of them
export our nurses all over India
do.
and to the Western world as well.
Let's go to Richard. And Seth, thank you very much for your question. Let's go to Richard in St Albans. Hello, Richard.
Oh, hello, Ian, and hi, Shashi. Pleasure to speak to you. I lived in India in the period you mentioned. I was there 2002, 2006. Rather interesting time. I had the pleasure of. I lived under the British High Commission. I was involved with the British Business Group, and when I came back to UK, I helped to set up something called the UK India Business Council. My question, India is an amazing place, and people always say to me, Richard, what do you think about it? And I always say, I love it and I hate it. It's just the nature of the place, isn't it? So, lovely people. And a big plug for Kerala. Ian, you definitely need to go to Kerala, no question. So, look, my question is...
I think we should do an outside broadcast from Kerala at some point.
I think we should.
Definitely.
Happy to join you.
I'll be with you. I'm coming. So, look, it's always frustrated me. And I always saw the business. I was there involved with the business as well as my other status. But it always frustrated me that UK still does talk about this special relationship and the shared heritage. But and by the way, I'm a big fan of the book Inglorious Empire, and I share your views on that one.
Thank you.
I just feel that the way that the Brits approach India let me be honest, I find it quite patronising. It's based on the past. It's a bit like saying, let's be friends with the Danish because you remember the good old days of the Vikings. It's not, you know what I mean? I make a joke about it.
That's a great analogy, Richard. Thank you. Yeah.
Exactly. And I really feel that. So my question is, what should be the basis of our future relationship?
Well, I think if you could lose to us at cricket a bit more often, I think that'll go very well.
Don't mention cricket at the moment. Although we did beat New Zealand.
The 5th Test match coming up of the incomplete series that was interrupted by COVID last year. So there's a good clue. We can tell the British. Now, jokes apart. I think frankly, we have, because the relationship, amazingly enough, ended without too much of bitterness and recrimination. People were able to look beyond the historical injustices of the British, which obviously I've highlighted in Inglorious Empire and others are very conscious of, to what we have in common. There is the English language, there is cricket, there are shared institutions, and partly a shared history. Though I was shocked to discover that you can study history right up to A-levels in Britain and not learn a thing about your colonial empire, which is quite horrifying.
I'm not sure that's true.
That is true. I've checked multiple times, including with parents of people who are doing A-levels. It's an optional thing, yeah. But to come back to your question, Richard, I'd say that harp on what you have in common, but also I think treat India with the respect it deserves as a country of the size, the population, the GDP. We have a higher GDP than Britain right now. So it's something that requires, therefore, a certain
You have got 1.3 billion people.
Well, that's true. but the fact...
It's not a competition,
Well, I think you wouldn't have an easy time competing on that number. Because no, exactly. I think you're at, 70 million right now or thereabats?
68.
68, yeah. So
I think you have overtaken us in the GDP league. You're absolutely right.
I mean, you'll soon be the size of a good size, the Indian city or something. But anyway, I think that's it, and of course it should be about mutuality of interest. For everything you seek, you have to give, and there's got to be that mutual give and take.
Richard, would you like to come back?
No, I absolutely agree. I think my own experience. When I first went to India, I was like everybody else. I think I was just thinking of call centres, but my eyes were opened by the incredible opportunity, and I just felt that frustrated me. And I think even today, I'm still, I'm listening to all these reports from McKinsey about. Well, if I go back 15 years, the future of our trade is going to be billions and billions, but it never quite materialises. And so I just kind of think, well, who in the British government right now is actually responsible for making sure that we have those sorts of... I don't mean of guys...
I do think that after Brexit, there's a genuine determination to conclude a trade deal with India and with other Commonwealth countries to compensate, as it were, for losing out on the EU. And I think that would be a powerful driver.
A text here from Annette, who says, fascinating interview with Shashi. So much information about India and his region of Kerala. Will be buying his book. See, it does work coming on a programme.
Great,
like
I'm
this.
glad.
It will sell your books.
Tuned into that
The Struggle for India's Soul, Nationalism and the Fate of Democracy by Shashi Tharoor is published by Hearst and it's available now. Thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed it.